I have a question for Mark. How true is the story? Okay, so the cats were actually parachuted down?
Yeah, yes, it's a true story.
Okay. And I mean, I have to say that I appreciate everything you said about story and the power of story to warm its way into our hearts. But I know that the first thing my students will say is it true or is it not true? I try to tell them stories, and every time they have spent 15 minutes after class looking up if, I was actually telling the truth, and then they've come to talk to me afterwards and said, it was actually true, and they were surprised by that.
And that's engagement. So I often actually ask, have any of you heard this story before in class? And most haven't. So it's important to choose one that's engaging and yet is likely to be unusual.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question about structured academic controversy. And that's at the point where they're supposed to come to consensus, what is the incentive for groups to come to consensus?
Great question. So often they don't, because you're giving them a time frame, and so then I ask them what was holding them up in achieving consensus, and and so we debrief on that difficult notion of consensus, because it's a word that's used a lot out there, everywhere, and so it's a good opportunity for them to reflect on what it means, who we expect to achieve consensus, and how that process takes place. Some feel bound to. Others just, they can't get there in the time frame provided.
I also occasionally use a story in class, and like Mark, I'll ask, have you heard the story before? And usually no. But then a day later or so, a student may tell me her mother or her father heard the story. And I've also received an email from a parent saying, see, you're still there, you're telling the story. The good thing is, so far, it's just parents. Probably one day soon it will be a grandparent.
Hey there, I had a question about the academic controversy as well. So you said the point was to sort of move away from a pro-con debate. And I'm wondering why then you choose a sort of two-sided group. Why not have like more, I mean, obviously time constraint is probably the major factor, but why not have more than just the two perspectives?
For the purposes of this, so we talk about different strategies to teach students to discuss. And we talk about them on a spectrum of most scaffolded to least scaffolded. So a Socratic seminar would be the least scaffolded, and I know I'm doing educational jargon. So when you're teaching adolescents to break things into steps and understand how to do something, sometimes you have to explicitly teach discussion. So with the college students, this has a lot of different perspectives, sort of vaguely, here's the group that's for it and against it. But sometimes adolescents really need to sort of be assigned, this is your side. So it depends who my audience is and how prescriptive I am. To your question, it's just the nature of that instructional approach. If there's something that doesn't have an obvious pro or con, we use a different approach, a Socratic seminar or some other discussion method.
I have another question regarding the structured academic controversy. I know you're using it within your face-to-face class at Curry, but within the website, are there strategies and scenarios of how that process can be used in an online classroom in a variety of topics to develop or craft a group project that would involve establishing positions and just using that same step, but in a fully online class?
I think it's something that could easily be adapted to online, because the follow-up in the methods classes, they have to create their own, and sometimes it would be perfect for face-to-face, others it could be adapted to online. In the issues class, I just use it as a way to get them to talk about issues. But the students generate really interesting academic controversies. Their favorite is, of course, to choose the Second Amendment, and that gets heated. But yeah, it would be a perfect thing for online.
I have a question for all three of the speakers in terms of how much, it seems that many of you use the same tools, like the same story or the same paper demo, for instance, but how much time you spent developing those the first time, and how often you modify those or change those or add new ones, that type of thing.
So with the paper demos, I usually spend maybe 5 or 6 hours the first time through developing it, thinking about what it is, what the key ideas are that I want to illustrate, and then putting that together. And in terms of the modification, that's a huge part of it. And so that's something that changes every single semester. I might spend another hour making a tweak. After having shown this to Marva, this is not identical, the one that we did today, to what I used with my students this semester. And I am going to change it further before using it with my students again. So I learn every time I use it in terms of how it could be improved. But those improvements are usually quite rapid and easy. So it's the first time through in the development, for me at least.
I would say first time through in development for my contemporary educational issues. The issues change, the politicians determining policy change, so that always takes a lot of prep work, particularly whenever there's an administrative shift in education policy. So.
And it's hard to say. I mean, you just constant reading, you're looking for things, and I keep a tickler file and different things, which I lose things in. But that's the goal, is to find things that you might be able to use again. If any of you have strategies for that, I'd like to know about that.
I would just add to all these great ideas, that's a super question, and it's a key question if you're thinking about changing from a traditional lecture format to a more interactive format. You can start, and the TRC recommends you start very small. So Dave gave us a great model about, he uses these for some of his topics, but there are topics he hasn't created them for, and that he's finding they're working, so he's going to continue to create them. So it's good to start small and invest in 1 or 2 or 3 that you think will make a big difference. And then if it does and you tweak them, then start adding so that your time is much better spent.
Yeah, I had a question for Stephanie. What do you do in the last part when students get their individual perspective? How do you get them to counter the pressure to conform? Because, I mean, I'm not sure what other people's students are like, but I know mine tend to conform greatly.
Because it has to be about the reading. So evidence-based discussion. If they have an opinion, fantastic. Find something that supports it. And we talk about the nature of evidence, what is good evidence, what that means. So in the methods class, they have to use the Constitution to support the perspective. That's the good thing about the Constitution, I guess. And in the issues class, they have to find some sort of policy document or readings that are not just Wikipedia to support what they view. So it's about evidence-based discussion, so it goes back to the learning objectives. What I want them to walk away is how to have an evidence-based discussion. And we talk about what that looks like. We pull up comment sections beneath like a Washington Post or New York Times articles, and we sort them into those that were evidence-based and those were polemics based on personal views. And we sort of unpack what each one of those looks like. And so it's very much a structured thing. And we talk about how discussion's a learned skill and how using to write or form an opinion is a learned skill. We also have those norms and expectations. It can't be a you statement, it's an I statement, and all those kind of things that sort of relate back to the culture of the classroom, which I couldn't fit in given that Marva told me 5 minutes.
This question is for Mark and Stephanie. I wanted to know, do you all use any kind of primary resources or archival sources in their original form? And if you don't, do you see how that could be integrated, or if it would be a good fit for your classes?
Yes, when we're working on the teaching and learning of history and contemporary educational issues. So for teaching and learning of history and government, we go to the original sources. We use extensive primary sources. And we often talk about how they're going to be working with students who don't always read and process information very well and need a lot of structure and reading instruction. So we'll actually go through archives and choose provocative images from history and talk about how an image can be something that is warranting discussion, and how do you use evidence from the image to teach students to talk and engage in discussion. I also have them pull different primary sources to create their own structured academic controversy. And then in contemporary educational issues, they're not as exciting, but we go back to the original laws and policies that on the Department of Education website and at the national and state level. They don't like those as much.
And my answer would be wherever possible, although I don't often discover the stories or the notions from the original archival piece. I discover them from third-party accounts, and then I look for them so I can get the true story. So.
I just wanted to follow up really quick. So are you using them in their digital surrogates, the primary sources? Okay, and not in the actual, both? Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you.
Just a quick question for Stephanie. I'm not clear on the time frame. Surely you don't do this in 50 minutes. How many class periods does it take to do an SAC?
It depends. It can take place in 15 minutes. It's just very abbreviated, or it can be an entire class period. So it depends on the topic, how long the reading is, how much background knowledge students have, and so the unhelpful answers. It's going to very much depend on the topic and what you want students to walk away with. Typically, we do it weekly. It's designed to be very brief, and I have to frame with students that you're going to walk away deeply unsatisfied with the amount of time you had to engage in this conversation. And then 1 week, we'll spend the whole class period, and they'll walk away and say, that was so much better. And then we get to have a great talk about how time is the enemy of all teachers.
Again, for Stephanie. So given most students, most teachers wouldn't even have any experience in how do you build consensus and what is consensus decision making, do you offer them instruction in that? And part of that is kind of piggybacking on that concern too. They have to reach consensus, which sounds like they have to put aside their own views perhaps, especially since you said the second part is afterwards, then they can say what they really meant. So it almost sounds like for them consensus is giving in somewhat, or could be giving in for some people.
Which is what we start by saying, what is the definition? What are examples and non-examples? And do high-quality examples of consensus exist? And remember, these are future history teachers, and sometimes they get so focused on the facts, they forget the big ideas. So it's a great teachable moment. And when does consensus exist in our history and our government, and when doesn't it? What does it look like? And now let's make this really small in class. What does it look like for the purposes of this discussion? And sometimes, as a teacher, you'll get a nice warning in, oh, hey, this wasn't a great topic, because they genuinely don't care, and consensus is reached immediately. And it's just like, they're like, okay, let's move on, lady. Consensus is most interesting to watch when it's hard for them to get to or they never do, and then we debrief about the nature of the topic and what that has to do with and what goes into recognizing other perspectives and coming to what is, and really unpacking what that means, which I don't think I answered your question, but that's our thinking, and that leads to great discussion.